The alarm inside my scout pod screams before I even open my eyes, and for one heartbeat I think we have already been discovered. My name is Vex Calor, and I have flown quiet missions into 11 different star systems without a single mistake. This is supposed to be my 12th. This is supposed to be easy. I slap the console to silence the alarm and pull myself upright in the cramped cockpit. The screen in front of me is not an enemy signal. It is a proximity warning from my own ship, telling me that I have drifted closer to the blue and green planet below than my mission profile allows. I breathe out slowly and correct my course. My hands are steady. My mind, less so. Earth. That is what the natives call this world. A small, unremarkable planet according to every briefing document the GoneHFY Compact handed me before I left. Third rock from a yellow star. Mostly water, thin atmosphere, weak enough gravity that a war fleet could bring it under control within a single cycle. That is what the officers told the War Council. That is what the War Council believed. That is why I am here alone, in a cloaked scout pod no larger than a supply crate, sent to confirm what everyone already assumes to be true. I check my restraints, tighten the strap across my chest, and let the ship fall into a lower, slower orbit. Cloaking field steady, engine signature suppressed, sensors active, everything by the book. My claws tap against the edge of the console as I wait for the first scan to complete. I have done this before. Aethazar 4, Kryllus Minor, the moons of Sevox. Every time, the pattern is the same. Find the population centers. Count the soldiers. Measure the ships. Send the numbers home. Let the fleet commanders decide how many days the conquest will take. I expect Earth to be no different. The scan completes with a soft chime, and I lean forward to read the results. The numbers do not make sense. I blink, certain my display is malfunctioning, and I tap the reset key. The scanner recalibrates, sweeps the planet a second time, layer by layer, region by region. I watch the progress bar creep across the screen, with a patience I do not actually feel. When it finishes, the same numbers appear, and this time there is no comfort in blaming the equipment. According to my sensors, the largest standing military force ever recorded by GoneHFY scouts belonged to the Thessari Empire, a species we conquered 2 generations ago after a brutal campaign that lasted almost a full cycle. Their combined defense force, at the absolute height of their power, numbered slightly under 2 million soldiers. Earth's active military personnel, according to my first pass, sits somewhere above 27 million. I stare at the number until my eyes ache. Then I check it again. 27 million active soldiers. Not reserves, not militia, not the population that could be conscripted in an emergency. Simply the number of humans who are already trained, already equipped, and already wearing a uniform on any given day, spread across dozens of separate nations that do not even share the same language or government. My translator implant hums quietly behind my ear, still processing fragments of human broadcasts it has intercepted since I entered orbit. I mute it for a moment, needing silence to think. This cannot be an invasion target. This is something else entirely. I run a diagnostic on my own equipment first, because the simplest explanation is usually that the machine is wrong, not that the universe has suddenly changed its rules. The diagnostic returns clean. Every sensor, every relay, every calibration point checks out within acceptable limits. My scout pod is functioning exactly as it should, which means the numbers are real. I open a secondary window on my display and begin cross-referencing the figure against known scaling laws. Every species the compact has ever encountered follows a predictable pattern. A planet with a population in the low billions will typically produce a standing force somewhere between 1 and 3% of that population, depending on culture, technology, and how recently they fought a war among themselves. Earth's population, according to the same scan, sits at roughly 8 billion individuals. 27 million is not 3% of 8 billion, it is barely a third of 1%. For a moment, relief washes over me. Perhaps the number is smaller than it looks, because humans have not yet reached full mobilization. Perhaps this is simply their peacetime force, the soldiers they keep on hand for ordinary policing and border patrol, nothing close to what they could produce if truly threatened. Then I find the second number, buried inside a public record my translator manages to decode from an open broadcast network the humans apparently do not bother to secure. It is labeled in their language as reserve and paramilitary personnel. 58 million more. I sit back in my seat and stare at the ceiling of my tiny cockpit, feeling something unfamiliar creep into my chest. It is not fear yet, it is closer to disbelief. The same feeling I imagine a swimmer might have upon realizing the water beneath them has no bottom. 85 million humans, trained and ready, before anyone has even declared a state of emergency. I force myself to keep working, because panic will not help the mission and will certainly not help me explain this to the War Council. I widen my scan, moving my scout pod slowly around the planet's curve, gathering data from different regions, rather than trusting a single reading. Perhaps this is a strange anomaly limited to one nation, one continent, one unusually militarized region that does not represent the planet as a whole. The results that come back only make things worse. Every major landmass I scan shows the same troubling pattern. Different nations, different governments, different colors marked on the crude political maps my translator pulls from human data networks. And yet every single one of them maintains an armed force disproportionate to anything the compact has encountered before. Some are smaller, certainly. A handful of island nations show forces numbering only in the tens of thousands. But the largest nations, the ones spanning entire continents, report numbers that climb into the millions each, sometimes tens of millions, with supporting industries that appear capable of arming and equipping far more than what is currently active. I notice something else too, something that unsettles me more than the raw numbers. The human networks are not hiding this information. I found these figures on open channels, broadcast without encryption, discussed openly in what appears to be public debate and news reporting. A species preparing for secret war does not publish its troop counts for any passing observer to find. A species that publishes these numbers either does not understand the danger they represent or does not believe anyone would dare attack them in the first place. Neither possibility comforts me. I think back to the briefing room aboard the flagship, 3 days before I departed for this mission. Commander Threx stood at the head of the table, tail flicking with impatience, as junior officers presented preliminary data gathered from long-range sensors. The numbers back then looked reasonable, ordinary, exactly what we expected from a pre-spaceflight civilization still fighting itself over borders and resources. Nobody in that room imagined what I am now looking at with my own scanners. I remember Threx's exact words, translated once more in my memory. He said Earth would fall within one cycle, perhaps less, given how fractured and disorganized their governments appeared to be. He said their inability to unite would be their greatest weakness, and that the Compact's disciplined, singular command structure would overwhelm any resistance they attempted to organize. Looking at the numbers scrolling across my display now, I am no longer certain fractured means weak. I decide to test one more theory before I send anything back to the fleet. Perhaps these numbers represent something symbolic rather than literal, a cultural exaggeration meant for their own internal propaganda, rather than an accurate account of real military strength. Species with fragile confidence sometimes inflate their own numbers to appear stronger than they truly are. I have seen it before on smaller, weaker worlds desperate to avoid conquest. I redirect my scanners toward a cluster of coordinates my translator flags as a training facility, hoping to visually confirm whether the reported numbers hold any truth. My scout pod drifts lower, careful to remain hidden within the planet's upper atmosphere, and I watch through a magnified feed as thousands of human figures move in disciplined formation across an open field far below, row after row after row of them, marching, running, training with equipment I do not yet recognize. And this is only one facility, one dot among what my sensors suggest are hundreds of similar installations scattered across a single nation, itself only one of dozens on this planet. I mute my display for a moment and simply breathe. The numbers are not exaggerated. If anything, watching the scale of a single training ground makes me wonder if the true count might be higher than what appeared in the public records I intercepted. My hands, when I look down at them, are trembling slightly against the console. I have scouted 11 worlds before this one. I have watched armies march, watched fleets assemble, watched entire civilizations prepare for wars they believed were inevitable. Nothing prepared me for a species that treats tens of millions of trained soldiers as a normal, unremarkable baseline, worthy of nothing more than a passing mention in their own public discussions. I check the time remaining on my mission window. 6 hours until I am required to return to the rendezvous point and transmit my findings to the fleet. 6 hours to understand what I am truly looking at before I have to explain it to commanders who have already decided this conquest will be simple. I pull up a fresh display and begin recording a full report, forcing my voice to remain level as I speak into the log. Scout designation Vex Calor, preliminary survey of designated target world, human records classification, cycle report 1 of 5. I pause, unsure how to phrase what comes next without sounding as though I have lost my composure entirely. Initial troop assessment suggests standing military forces significantly exceed all previous first contact scenarios encountered by the compact. Recommend extreme caution before committing to standard invasion timeline. I stop the recording and sit in silence for a long moment, staring down at the blue and green world turning slowly beneath me, utterly unaware, or perhaps simply unbothered, by the fact that it is being watched. Something tells me this world holds far more secrets than a single scan can reveal, and I still have hours left before I must decide exactly how much of the truth I am willing to send back to a fleet that already believes it knows the answer. I decide the only way forward is to stop trusting summaries and start pulling raw data directly from the source. Public broadcasts can be filtered, shaped, or exaggerated for reasons I do not yet understand, but infrastructure does not lie. Factories either exist or they do not. Shipyards either produce vessels or they sit empty. If I can trace the machinery behind the numbers, I will know whether what I am seeing is truth or performance. I guide my scout pod into a wider orbit, adjusting my scanners to search for industrial signatures rather than population centers. My translator continues working in the background, converting fragments of human language into something my mind can process, though it still struggles with slang and regional variation. I ignore the noise and focus on the readings. The first industrial cluster I locate sits along a coastline in a nation my translator labels, with a short, hard-sounding word. Massive structures line the shore, metal frameworks taller than anything I expected from a species without unified space travel. I zoom my optical sensors closer and watch as enormous hulls take shape inside dry docks, worked on by machines and human hands together in a rhythm that looks almost musical in its coordination. I count 14 vessels under construction in this single location alone. Not small transport ships or fishing vessels, but hulls large enough to carry thousands of personnel and heavy equipment across their oceans. My scanner estimates completion times based on visible progress, and the numbers suggest this one shipyard alone could produce several new vessels every single cycle. I check my records for comparison. The entire Drenai Compact, across our home system and 3 colonized worlds, maintains 12 primary shipyards capable of producing war vessels at any given time. This single human nation appears to operate at least 6 shipyards of similar or greater scale, and I have not yet scanned the rest of the planet. My chest tightens as I move my scout pod further along the coast, searching for confirmation that this facility is simply unusual, an outlier rather than the standard. Instead, I find 2 more shipyards within the same short flight path, each one active, each one producing vessels at a pace that leaves me questioning my own calculations. I force myself to slow down and think clearly rather than let the numbers overwhelm me. Perhaps these vessels are not military in nature. Perhaps they serve commercial or transport purposes, moving goods and people across their oceans rather than preparing for conflict. It would explain the scale without requiring me to believe this entire species stands ready for war at all times. I redirect my scanners to examine the vessels more closely, searching for weapon signatures or armor plating that would confirm military purpose. The results come back mixed. Some ships show no weapon systems at all, consistent with cargo or passenger transport, but a significant portion, nearly a third by my count, show hardened hulls, weapon mounting points, and internal structures clearly designed for military use. I pull back from the shipyards and widen my search once more, this time looking for aircraft rather than ships. My scanners sweep across several dozen locations my translator identifies as air bases, and the pattern repeats itself with unsettling consistency. Rows of aircraft sit parked along long strips of pavement, engines cold but maintained, crews moving between them in organized patterns that suggest constant readiness rather than occasional use. I count the aircraft at a single base and multiply by the number of similar bases my sensors detect across just one continent. The number that results makes my throat tighten. I do not trust it enough to record it yet. I need more confirmation before I commit anything to my official log. My scout pod drifts lower still, careful to remain within the safety margins of my cloaking field, and I begin tracking individual patterns of movement rather than static counts. I watch convoys of ground vehicles moving along paved roads that stretch farther than any road network I have seen on a conquered world. I watch supply depots stacked high with crates and containers, their contents unknown to me but clearly vast in quantity. I notice something else as I continue my survey, something that unsettles me more than raw numbers ever could. The humans do not appear to be hiding any of this. Their broadcasts openly discuss troop movements, defense budgets, and military exercises as though these things are simply part of ordinary public life. On every world the Compact has previously scouted, military strength was treated as a closely guarded secret, revealed only when necessary, and always understated to avoid inviting attack. Humans seem to do the opposite. The openness of their information suggests either supreme confidence or a complete lack of awareness that anyone beyond their own planet might be watching. Given what I have already witnessed regarding the scale of their forces, I find myself leaning toward the former possibility, and that thought alone sends a cold feeling through me that has nothing to do with the temperature inside my cockpit. I decide to test something else, a theory forming slowly in the back of my mind. If humans truly maintain forces of this size during ordinary peacetime, I want to understand how quickly they could expand those numbers if faced with an actual threat. Every species has a mobilization curve, a measurable rate at which additional forces can be trained, equipped, and deployed once a conflict begins. Understanding that curve will tell me more about the true danger of this world than any static troop count ever could. I search through human broadcast archives for records of past mobilizations, moments when their various nations faced serious internal conflicts and needed to rapidly expand their available forces. My translator struggles at first with the volume of information, human record-keeping proving far more extensive and detailed than anything I encountered on previous scouted worlds. Eventually, I find what I am looking for, a set of historical records describing a period of widespread conflict among human nations roughly 8 decades before my current observation point, based on their own calendar systems. I begin reading through translated summaries, and the picture that emerges makes my earlier concerns feel almost quaint by comparison. According to these records, several human nations, faced with a shared external threat, expanded their military forces from a combined baseline of a few million personnel to over 100 million within a span of roughly 6 of their calendar years. Factories that previously produced civilian goods converted entirely to military production within months. Entire populations shifted their daily lives toward supporting the war effort, whether through direct service or through labor supporting that service. I stare at these numbers for a long time, running calculations in my head that keep producing results I do not want to believe. If a threatened nation could expand its forces by that magnitude within a matter of years, using the technology available to them 8 decades ago, I can only guess at what their current industrial and technological capacity might allow them to accomplish now. I pull up additional records, searching for more recent examples of rapid mobilization, hoping perhaps that period represented an unusual peak rather than a repeatable pattern. Instead, I find smaller-scale versions of the same behavior occurring repeatedly throughout human history whenever a serious enough threat presented itself. Different nations, different eras, different specific numbers, but always the same underlying pattern. Humans do not simply maintain large standing forces. They maintain the infrastructure, the industrial base, and apparently the cultural willingness to expand those forces dramatically whenever circumstances demand it. I close the historical records for a moment and simply sit with what I have learned, letting my translator continue its quiet work in the background while I try to organize my thoughts into something coherent enough to report. The numbers I found in my first scan were not exaggerated, and they were not even the most important discovery. The true danger of this world is not the 27 million active soldiers or the 85 million trained reserves currently available. The true danger is the demonstrated capacity to multiply those numbers many times over within a relatively short span of time, should this species ever perceive itself to be under serious threat. And if my scout ships and the rest of the compact fleet have already been detected, even partially, I have no way of knowing whether that mobilization has already begun. I check my sensors once more, searching for any sign that human authorities have noticed the fleet's approach, or my own scout pod's presence in their orbit. The readings remain quiet, no unusual military movements beyond the baseline activity I have already documented, no signs of alarm or emergency response. For now, at least, we remain undetected, but the confidence I carried into this mission, the assumption that Earth would prove to be a simple, straightforward conquest, has completely eroded over the course of a single scan session. I glance at the clock on my display. 4 hours remain before I must return to the rendezvous point. 4 hours to decide exactly how to explain what I have found to commanders who have already convinced themselves this world poses no real challenge, and who may not welcome a scout who tells them otherwise. I begin preparing my next set of scans, determined to gather as much additional information as possible before I have to face that difficult conversation. Something tells me the numbers I have already found are only the beginning of what this world has to reveal, and I am not yet certain I am prepared for whatever comes next. My translator chimes softly, alerting me to an incoming audio signal it has managed to isolate from the general noise of human broadcasts. I almost ignore it, still lost in the weight of the mobilization records I just finished reading, but something makes me open the channel instead. It is not a military transmission. It is what my translator identifies as a public radio broadcast, a woman's voice speaking calmly about local events, weather patterns, and something called a community gathering happening later that day. I listen for a moment, struck by how ordinary it sounds, how utterly disconnected from the scale of military production I just witnessed along the coastline. A man's voice joins hers partway through the broadcast, laughing at something she said, and the two of them move on to discuss a sporting event scheduled for the following week. I sit in my cockpit listening to this exchange, two humans named Grace and Peter according to the broadcast introduction, talking about nothing more dangerous than a ball game, completely unaware that somewhere above their heads a scout from another star system is recording every word. The contrast unsettles me more than any weapon count could. These are not soldiers. These are not commanders planning strategy. These are ordinary people, living ordinary lives, and yet the infrastructure supporting their entire civilization appears capable of producing military force on a scale that dwarfs anything the Compact has ever assembled. I close the audio channel and return to my primary task, determined to understand how a species manages to maintain that kind of latent capability while its population goes about such unremarkable daily routines. The answer, I suspect, lies buried somewhere in their own history, and I intend to find it. I widen my search parameters and instruct my translator to prioritize records related to conflict, war, and organized combat throughout human history, regardless of time period or location. The volume of information that floods back nearly overwhelms my processing systems. Humans, it seems, have documented their conflicts with an obsessive level of detail, preserving records that stretch back thousands of their calendar years. I begin with the most recent examples, the ones closest to my own observation point, hoping to understand the current state of human military culture before diving into older history. The records describe a period of relative peace between the largest nations, punctuated by smaller regional conflicts that never seem to fully cease. Even during what humans apparently consider peaceful decades, I find evidence of continuous small-scale engagements happening somewhere on the planet at almost any given moment. This pattern alone tells me something important. Unlike species who experience war as a rare, catastrophic event followed by long periods of untested peace, humans appear to exist in a state of near-constant low-level conflict, even when their major powers are not directly fighting one another. Their soldiers are not simply trained and then left idle. They are rotated through actual combat experience regularly, refining their skills against real opposition rather than simulated exercises. I push further back into the records, searching for the largest conflicts humanity has ever recorded, hoping to understand the true ceiling of their military capability when fully provoked. What I find stops my breath entirely. Roughly a century before my current observation point, using their own calendar, the majority of human nations became embroiled in a conflict that spanned almost the entire planet simultaneously. My translator struggles briefly with the scale of the records, cross-referencing casualty figures, mobilization numbers, and industrial output data spread across thousands of individual documents. By the time the translator finishes compiling a summary, the combined number of humans who served in some military capacity during that single conflict exceeds 100 million. Industrial production during this period reached levels that dwarf even the impressive shipyards I witnessed earlier in my survey. Entire nations converted their civilian economies into war production almost overnight, building aircraft, vessels, and equipment at a rate that modern compact shipyards would need years to match. I read further, learning that this was not even the largest such conflict in human history. A second, even larger event occurred only decades after the first, this time spanning every inhabited continent and drawing in nearly every major nation on the planet at once. The combined military forces involved in that conflict, according to the records, exceeded 110 million personnel, supported by industrial output that reshaped entire national economies for the duration of the fighting. What strikes me most is not simply the size of these numbers, though they are staggering enough on their own. It is the speed at which humanity achieved this scale of mobilization, starting from forces that were, by their own historical standards, considered modest just years before the conflicts began. I find records describing how quickly civilian factories converted to military production once war began. Automobile manufacturers began producing aircraft within months. Clothing factories shifted to producing uniforms and equipment almost overnight. Entire populations, including those not directly serving in combat roles, redirected their daily labor toward supporting the war effort in whatever capacity they could contribute. I pause my research and lean back in my seat, trying to process the implications of what I am reading. The Compact's own war economy, impressive by the standards of every other species we have encountered, requires years of advanced planning to shift production toward military needs. Our shipyards, our factories, our training academies all operate on long, carefully managed timelines that assume conflicts will develop gradually, with ample warning before full mobilization becomes necessary. Humans, based on their own historical record, appear capable of achieving comparable mobilization within months rather than years, and they have done so multiple times throughout their relatively short recorded history. I search for information about how these conflicts eventually ended, hoping perhaps to find that such extreme efforts left humanity exhausted, unable or unwilling to repeat such mobilization again. Instead, I find that following each major conflict, human nations quickly return to a baseline of military readiness far exceeding what existed before the fighting began. Rather than demobilizing back to pre-conflict levels, they maintained larger standing forces than before, as though each conflict taught them lessons about the value of remaining prepared, rather than lessons about the cost of remaining vigilant. My translator flags an additional pattern within the records that catches my attention. Following the largest of these historical conflicts, human nations developed something called deterrence doctrine, a strategic philosophy built around maintaining forces powerful enough that no other nation would consider attacking them in the first place. This doctrine appears to have shaped their military culture for decades afterward, encouraging continuous investment in defense capability even during periods without active fighting. I begin to understand, slowly and with growing unease, that the numbers I found during my initial scans were not an aberration or an overreaction to some recent, temporary threat. They represent a deeply ingrained cultural pattern built through repeated experience with catastrophic conflict, reinforced by generations of strategic doctrine that treats military readiness as a permanent baseline rather than a temporary response to danger. I search further still, curious whether smaller nations without the resources of the largest powers show similar patterns, or whether this behavior is limited only to the wealthiest and most populous countries. The records suggest the pattern holds true even among smaller nations, though the absolute numbers differ significantly. Even countries with populations far smaller than the largest powers maintain military forces and defense industries disproportionate to what the compact typically expects from similarly sized populations elsewhere in the galaxy. I find myself returning to the audio recording of Grace and Peter discussing their upcoming sporting event, trying to reconcile the casual, peaceful tone of their conversation with everything I have just learned about the history and capability of their species. Perhaps, I realize, this is precisely why their military culture developed the way it did. A species that experienced repeated, devastating conflict throughout its history might come to value peaceful, ordinary moments precisely because they understand how quickly such moments can be disrupted and how much effort it takes to protect them. I check my remaining mission time and realize I have used more of my window than I intended, absorbed entirely in historical research that has left me with far more questions than answers. 2 hours remain before I must return to the rendezvous point and deliver whatever report I can assemble from everything I have witnessed today. I begin compiling my findings into a structured report, though I find myself struggling with how to phrase certain sections. How does one explain to a war council, already committed to a rapid and confident invasion timeline, that the target species maintains a demonstrated historical capacity to mobilize over 100 million trained personnel within months, supported by industrial production capable of matching or exceeding anything the compact has ever fielded? I decide to include the raw numbers without excessive interpretation, allowing the commanders to draw their own conclusions rather than risk my personal assessment being dismissed as exaggeration or unwarranted caution. Facts, I hope, will speak for themselves more effectively than my own concerns ever could. As I finalize the historical section of my report, my sensors chime with an incoming transmission from elsewhere in the fleet. Another scout, apparently assigned to a different region of the planet, is attempting to establish contact through our shared encrypted channel. I open the connection, curious whether their findings align with mine or whether my own region happened to represent an unusual outlier within the broader survey. The voice that comes through belongs to a scout I recognize from previous briefings, though we have never worked together directly before. Their tone, even filtered through the encrypted channel, carries an unmistakable edge of tension that mirrors exactly what I have been feeling throughout my own survey. They ask whether my readings match certain figures they have compiled, figures they seem hesitant to state directly, as though speaking the numbers aloud might somehow make them more real or more difficult to dismiss. I share my own findings in return, watching as a brief pause stretches across the channel before they respond. Their numbers, gathered from an entirely different continent using independent sensor equipment, align almost precisely with everything I discovered on my own. Whatever we are looking at, it is not a regional anomaly or a localized concentration of military strength. It appears to be a consistent, planet-wide pattern, repeated across every nation and continent either of us has managed to survey. We agree to compile our reports together before returning to the fleet, hoping that a combined presentation, supported by independent confirmation from separate sources, might carry more weight with commanders who could easily dismiss a single scout's concerns as exaggeration or excessive caution. Neither of us feels confident that even this combined evidence will be enough to change minds already committed to a specific plan, but it feels like the only responsible course of action available to us. As I begin preparing the final sections of my report, integrating the historical data with my own initial troop counts and the newly shared information from my fellow scout, I cannot shake the feeling that we are standing at the edge of a decision far larger than either of us fully understands. The fleet commanders expect a straightforward confirmation that this world represents an easy conquest. What I am prepared to deliver instead is a warning that everything we assumed about this species may have been fundamentally, dangerously wrong from the very beginning. The return flight to the flagship feels longer than it should, though my instruments confirm the journey takes exactly as long as it always does. I spend the time reviewing my report one final time, searching for any way to present the information that might soften its impact without compromising its accuracy. I find none. The numbers are what they are, and no amount of careful phrasing will make them easier to accept. My scout pod docks within the flagship's landing bay with a soft mechanical clamp, and I unstrap myself from the pilot's seat, gathering my data drives before stepping out into the corridor. The ship hums with its usual quiet efficiency, crew members moving between stations with the calm confidence of a fleet that believes its coming victory is already assured. I make my way toward the council chamber, passing officers who nod at me with polite acknowledgement, unaware of what I carry with me. Word has not yet spread about my findings, and for a brief moment I envy their ignorance, knowing it will not last much longer. The council chamber doors slide open to reveal the same room where this mission began 3 days ago, though it feels different now, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves might already sense the shift about to occur. Commander Threx sits at the head of the long table, flanked by senior officers, whose names I recognize from years of service records, though I have rarely interacted with them directly. Another scout stands near the far wall, and I recognize the posture immediately as belonging to the colleague who contacted me during my survey. Their name, I learn as I approach, is Yarrick de Saul, assigned to survey a continent on the opposite side of the planet from my own designated region. We exchange a brief glance, silent acknowledgement passing between us, before either of us speaks a word to the assembled council. Threx gestures for us to begin without preamble, clearly expecting a routine confirmation of what everyone already believes to be true. I step forward first, since my report was compiled slightly earlier, and I activate the display embedded in the center of the table, projecting my initial findings for the room to see. I begin with the raw numbers, presenting the active military personnel count without embellishment, allowing the figure to speak for itself before I continue further. 27 million active soldiers. I watch several officers around the table exchange skeptical glances, clearly assuming some error in my calculations or equipment. I continue before anyone can interrupt, presenting the reserve and paramilitary figures next, followed by the industrial capacity data gathered from the shipyards and air bases I surveyed personally. I describe watching vessels under construction, aircraft maintained in constant readiness, supply depots stocked with equipment I could not fully identify, but which clearly represented significant investment in sustained military capability. Threx finally speaks, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a commander who has heard exaggerated reports before and knows how to separate genuine concern from unwarranted panic. He asks whether I considered the possibility that my sensors malfunctioned, or that I misread population data that included civilian infrastructure alongside genuine military assets. I explain, as calmly as I can manage, that I ran multiple diagnostic checks throughout my survey, cross-referencing findings across different sensor systems and confirming visually wherever possible. I describe the training facility I observed directly, watching thousands of human figures move through disciplined formations with my own optical sensors, leaving no room for sensor error or misinterpretation. A murmur passes through the room, though Threx's expression remains carefully neutral, giving away nothing of his own internal reaction to what I am presenting. He turns to Yarrick next, asking whether their independent survey produced similar findings or whether my numbers represented an isolated anomaly limited to my specific region. Yarrick steps forward and activates their own display, presenting figures gathered from an entirely different continent, using separate equipment and independent verification methods. The numbers align closely with mine, confirming that whatever pattern we discovered is not localized but represents a planet-wide characteristic of this species. I watch the room's mood shift as Yarrick continues, presenting additional data about industrial output and mobilization capacity that closely mirrors my own historical research. Several officers, who initially appeared skeptical, now lean forward, studying the numbers more carefully, their earlier confidence giving way to something more cautious. Threx remains silent for a long moment after Yarrick finishes speaking, his claws tapping slowly against the polished surface of the table. Finally, he asks the question I have been dreading since I began compiling my report. He wants to know what recommendation we intend to make regarding the invasion timeline, given everything we have presented. I glance toward Yarrick briefly before answering, and something in their expression tells me we share the same conclusion, even though neither of us has discussed this specific point directly. I explain that, based on the data we gathered, I cannot in good conscience recommend proceeding with the current invasion plan without significant revision. The forces this species could mobilize, both immediately and through rapid wartime expansion, far exceed what our current fleet strength was designed to overcome based on the original threat assessment. The room falls into an uncomfortable silence following my statement, broken only by quiet murmurs among the assembled officers as they process what I have said. Threx studies me carefully, and for a moment I wonder whether he intends to dismiss my recommendation entirely, perhaps assuming that caution born from unfamiliarity with a new species has clouded my judgment. Instead, he turns toward one of his aides and requests a live feed connection to the planet's surface, something I did not expect given how quickly this meeting was called. I watch as technicians work quickly to establish the connection, pulling data directly from orbital sensors currently monitoring the planet in real time, separate from anything Yarrick or I gathered during our individual surveys. The display flickers to life, showing a live overview of military activity across several regions of the planet simultaneously. What I see confirms everything I feared and introduces a new concern I had not yet considered. Recruitment centers, marked clearly by my translator's ongoing analysis of human broadcast signals, show activity levels notably higher than the baseline figures I recorded during my own survey just hours earlier. Training facilities that appeared to operate at standard capacity during my observation now show increased personnel movement, additional equipment being distributed, and expanded activity that suggests deliberate escalation rather than routine operation. Threx leans forward, studying the display with an intensity that betrays the confidence he displayed just moments earlier. He asks his aide whether this activity correlates with any known trigger, any specific event that might explain a sudden increase in military readiness across multiple regions simultaneously. The aide hesitates before answering, clearly reluctant to state the conclusion that seems obvious to everyone in the room. Eventually, they explain that the timing of this increased activity aligns closely with the initial approach of our fleet into the outer regions of this star system, several days before either Yarrick or myself were dispatched for individual reconnaissance. The implication settles over the room like a physical weight. Humans may have already detected our presence, or at minimum detected something unusual enough to warrant increased military readiness, well before we assumed our approach had gone unnoticed. If their recruitment and training activity is already increasing in response to a threat they may only partially understand, the true scale of their mobilization capacity remains almost entirely unknown to us. I watch Threx's expression shift from cautious skepticism to something closer to genuine concern, an emotion I have never before witnessed on his face during the years I have served under his command. He asks the room directly whether anyone present still believes the original invasion timeline remains viable, given everything we have learned within the past hour alone. Silence answers his question more clearly than any spoken response could have managed. One of the senior officers, a longtime strategist named Corvain Ashvel, finally breaks the silence by suggesting that immediate invasion may no longer represent a viable option, and that the fleet should instead consider a period of extended observation before committing to any further action. Threx nods slowly, clearly weighing this suggestion against the political and logistical pressures that likely accompany any decision to delay a mission already approved by higher command. I remain standing near the center of the room, watching the conversation unfold around me, aware that my initial report has fundamentally altered the trajectory of this entire mission within the span of a single briefing. Part of me feels a strange mixture of vindication and dread, relieved that my findings are being taken seriously, yet deeply unsettled by what those findings actually represent for the fleet's chances moving forward. Yarrick catches my eye from across the room, and I recognize in their expression the same uncertain relief I feel myself. Neither of us expected our reports to overturn months of prior planning so quickly, yet neither of us can deny the necessity of the shift now unfolding before us. Threx finally addresses the room as a whole, his voice carrying a weight and seriousness that was entirely absent when this meeting began. He announces that the fleet will pause its approach, maintaining maximum stealth protocols, while additional scouts are dispatched to gather further data before any final decision regarding invasion timing will be made. As the meeting begins to disperse, officers filing out of the chamber in quiet, contemplative groups, I find myself lingering near the display that still shows the live feed of increasing human military activity across the planet's surface. Something about watching those numbers climb in real time, even slightly, fills me with a growing certainty that whatever we choose to do next, The confident, straightforward conquest everyone imagined at the start of this mission no longer exists as a realistic possibility. I glanced toward the planet visible through the chamber's viewport, blue and green, and utterly unaware, or so we assumed, of the fleet quietly observing it from just beyond the edge of its solar system. For the first time since I began this mission, I find myself wondering not whether we can conquer this world, but whether we should have ever considered it a target in the first place. 3 additional scouts return over the following 2 days, each one confirming the same pattern across different regions of the planet, and each one reporting the same unsettling trend of gradually increasing military activity that appears directly tied to our fleet's continued presence at the edge of the system. Threx orders the fleet to hold position, refusing to commit to any further advance until a complete picture emerges, though I can sense the growing tension among the crew as delays stretch from days into what threatens to become weeks. I spend much of this waiting period reviewing additional data alongside Yarrick and the other returning scouts, searching for any detail that might help commanders understand exactly what kind of resistance we would face if the fleet ultimately decided to proceed. The picture that emerges from our combined efforts paints a species far more prepared for large-scale conflict than anything the Compact has encountered across its many previous conquests. On the 6th day of our extended observation period, an emergency alert pulls me from my quarters, and I hurry toward the command deck alongside dozens of other crew members responding to the same summons. Something has changed, and judging by the urgency in the alert tone, it has changed quickly. I arrive on the command deck to find Threx standing before the main view screen, his posture rigid with an intensity I have not seen from him before. The display shows sensor readings from the planet's surface, and even from a distance I can see enough detail to understand why the entire ship suddenly feels charged with tension. Human satellite networks, previously operating in what appeared to be standard peacetime configuration, have shifted dramatically over the past several hours. New objects, launched in rapid succession, now populate orbital space around the planet in numbers that continue climbing even as I watch. My translator struggles briefly to categorize the sudden surge of technical communications suddenly flooding every frequency we monitor. An officer stationed near the primary sensor array reports that human deep space tracking systems appear to have identified our fleet's position with far greater precision than we previously believed possible. Whatever stealth advantage we assumed we maintained throughout this extended observation period seems to have eroded more significantly than anyone anticipated. Threx orders immediate confirmation, and within minutes, a secondary report arrives that removes any remaining doubt. Human broadcast networks, monitored continuously by our translation systems, have begun openly discussing the presence of what they describe as unidentified objects near the edge of their solar system. Far from panicking or attempting to hide this discovery, their public discourse treats the revelation with a strange combination of caution and unwavering resolve. I watch as our sensors continue tracking the rapid deployment of additional orbital assets, human vessels launching from the shipyards and facilities I surveyed personally just days earlier, now moving into defensive formations around their home planet with a speed and coordination that suggests extensive prior planning rather than improvised reaction. Corvain Ashvel approaches the command display, studying the unfolding deployment with visible concern. He asks whether this level of readiness matches anything we anticipated based on our earlier scouting reports, and I find myself answering honestly that while we predicted significant mobilization capacity, witnessing it unfold in real time exceeds even our most cautious estimates. Threx orders a full sensor sweep of the entire system, determined to understand the complete scope of what we now face before making any further decisions. I remain on the command deck, watching alongside dozens of other crew members as data continues streaming in from every available source, painting an increasingly complete picture of a species mobilizing for conflict on a scale that dwarfs anything previously recorded in Compact history. Reports indicate that human ground forces, previously distributed across training facilities and permanent bases, have begun consolidating into forward positions, moving personnel and equipment toward coastal regions and strategic locations with an efficiency that speaks to well-rehearsed contingency planning. Civilian transportation networks, according to intercepted communications, have been repurposed to support military logistics, moving supplies and equipment at a pace that suggests their entire economic infrastructure can shift toward wartime production almost instantaneously. I recall the historical records I discovered during my initial survey, describing how quickly human civilian industries converted to military production during past conflicts. Watching similar patterns unfold now, in real time, confirms that this capability remains just as potent today as it proved decades ago within their own historical record. Threx calls together the full council once more, and I find myself standing in the same chamber where I delivered my initial report just days earlier, though the atmosphere now carries a gravity that feels entirely different from that first tense but relatively calm briefing. Every officer present appears to understand that whatever decision emerges from this meeting will determine the fate of the entire fleet. Corvain presents updated fleet strength comparisons, projecting our available forces against the mobilization data continuously streaming in from the planet's surface. The numbers, displayed side by side, tell a story that requires little additional interpretation. Our fleet, impressive by the standards of every previous campaign the Compact has undertaken, appears increasingly outmatched against a species capable of fielding forces an order of magnitude larger, supported by industrial capacity that could sustain such forces indefinitely. I watched Threx study these numbers in silence for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice carrying none of the confident authority he displayed when this mission first began. He asks the assembled council directly whether any officer present believes our current fleet strength remains sufficient to achieve the mission's original objectives, given everything we now understand about this species. The silence that follows stretches long enough to answer the question definitively, broken only when Yarrick steps forward, choosing to voice what the collective silence has already made clear. They explain, carefully but firmly, that continuing this mission under current conditions would place the entire fleet at unacceptable risk, given the demonstrated capacity of this species to mobilize forces far exceeding our own, supported by a level of industrial output and strategic planning that suggests decades of preparation for exactly this kind of contingency, even if that preparation was never specifically aimed at an extraterrestrial threat. I add my own perspective, drawing on everything I witnessed during my initial survey and everything we have collectively learned since. I explain that humanity's willingness to openly broadcast their military capabilities, rather than conceal them as most species would, suggests a level of confidence rooted in genuine strength rather than empty posturing. Their historical pattern of transforming rapidly from peacetime economies into full wartime production, repeated multiple times throughout their recorded history, indicates this is not a temporary or reactive buildup, but rather a deeply ingrained cultural and strategic capability that could sustain indefinite conflict if necessary. Threx listens to each perspective carefully, his expression unreadable as he processes the collective weight of everything presented before him. Finally, he turns toward the main view screen, studying the live feed of human defensive deployments still unfolding across the planet's orbital space. Ships and stations continuing to multiply even as our meeting continues. He asks one final question, directed toward the entire assembled council rather than any single officer. He wants to know whether anyone believes there remains any strategic advantage to proceeding with this mission, any scenario in which our current fleet could achieve a meaningful victory against a species demonstrating this level of readiness and capability. No one answers. The silence itself becomes the answer, settling over the chamber with a finality that feels almost physical in its weight. Threx nods slowly, and I watch something shift in his posture, the transformation of a commander accepting a reality he clearly never expected to face when this mission began. He orders an immediate withdrawal, instructing the fleet to retreat to a safe distance beyond the system's outer boundary, while a full strategic reassessment takes place back at Compact Command. The order spreads quickly throughout the ship, and I feel the subtle shift in the vessel's movement as our engines begin the process of reversing course, pulling us away from the blue and green planet that has occupied every waking thought I have had since this mission began. I remain on the command deck longer than necessary, watching the planet slowly shrink on the view screen as our fleet retreats toward the edge of the system. Yarrick joins me near the viewport, and for a long moment neither of us speaks, simply watching the world that so thoroughly upended everything the Compact assumed about this mission. Finally, They ask whether I believe humanity ever fully understood how close they came to invasion, or whether their mobilization simply represented standard defensive posture regardless of any specific threat. I consider the question carefully before answering, recalling the audio recording of Grace and Peter discussing their sporting event, utterly unaware of the fleet observing their planet from beyond the edge of their solar system. I explained that I suspect humanity's readiness exists independent of any specific threat, a permanent baseline shaped by generations of hard-learned lessons about the cost of being unprepared. Whether they specifically identified us as the source of recent tension or simply responded to unusual activity detected near their system boundary, their reaction demonstrates a species that treats vigilance as a constant rather than an exception. As our fleet crosses the final threshold marking the edge of the human solar system, I find myself recording one last entry into my personal log, aware that whatever recommendations emerge from Compact Command in the coming months will shape the future of our relationship with this remarkable and formidable species. Scout Designation Vex Calor. Final assessment following extended reconnaissance of designated target world. I pause briefly, choosing my words with the same care I applied throughout this entire mission. Initial assumptions regarding this species proved fundamentally incorrect. What appeared to be a fractured, technologically limited civilization instead demonstrates military capability, industrial capacity, and strategic resilience that exceeds every previous first contact scenario encountered by the Compact throughout its recorded history. Recommend permanent reclassification of this world as an unsuitable target for conventional invasion, pending further diplomatic or strategic reassessment by Compact Command. I close the log and turn back toward the view screen, watching the distant point of light that represents humanity's home star fade slowly into the background of countless other stars scattered across the darkness. Somewhere on that small blue and green world, life continues exactly as it did before our arrival. Populations going about their daily routines, with no clear indication of how close they came to conflict, or how thoroughly they changed the assumptions of an empire that had never before encountered a species quite like them. I do not know what Compact Command will ultimately decide regarding humanity's future, whether diplomacy, continued observation, or some entirely different approach will define our next contact with this world. What I know with absolute certainty, carried with me as our fleet retreats into the depths of space, is that whatever assumptions we carry into any future encounter with humanity, we would be wise to abandon the notion that this is a species that can be easily underestimated. The blue and green planet disappears entirely from view as our fleet accelerates toward the safety of open space, leaving behind a world that never knew how close it came to war, and a fleet that will never again assume that a quiet, seemingly ordinary civilization poses no real threat at all.